Present colors. Order. Colors.
Mark was well loved, well liked, and well suited for a career in the fire service. He served under many titles: firefighter, engine driver, lieutenant, instructor, mentor, influencer, and most important of all, friend. He served his community for 30 years and he did it well. His family can be proud of his service. As a department, we are proud of his legacy. As such, we honor him as a brother gone home, as a brother who will be missed.
Present arms.
A compliment that's often used to describe someone in regards to their generosity is that they would give the shirt off their back. No one actually does that. No one takes off their shirt and walks around bare-chested, except for Mark. Mark certainly would give the shirt off his back. He would take off his shoes. He would drive a stranger 100 miles out of his way to get there where they were going. Mark would stop and offer assistance to anyone and everyone, both in his personal life and his fire department life, which sometimes may have been frustrating for both his family and his colleagues at work. I met Mark through the fire service classes over 30 years ago. Mark attended a rope rescue class with several of his fellow Kirkland firefighters, and the hook was set. He liked this rope rescue thing, and he was going to be in it for good. He started coming down to the rope rescue program that we taught in Joshua Tree Park, and he became an instructor through the American Search and Rescue Institute. At that point, it's when we discovered that one of his many talents was his ability to draw, and he became our artist and spent many hours drawing the technical drawings for our rescue manual. He was active with the Lung Association and led Mount Rainier tree climbs for over 30 years. He convinced me to participate in one of those climbs with him. The bad news was that the weather was so bad that we never left Camp Here. We had no summit attempt. The good news is that I met my wife Renee on the climb, so that was a success. When we started the Peak Rescue Institute, Mark was on board and immediately began drawing multiple prototypes of our logo. Our final logo is one of Mark's handiwork, which I'm wearing on my cap and shirt today. Many of you here have probably been recipients of ski racks, shelving, hooks, shelf brackets, water rescue throw bags, stuff bags, and of course, fire starter. And if you didn't get any fire starter, I'm sure we probably have some of that lying around. I'm not sure, maybe in a previous life, Mark was left someplace where it was dark and cold, and he felt the need to always be able to light a fire. But he had hundreds of little bags of fire starter kits that he'd made. Over 20 years ago, Mark was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He had several of them and went through 2 grueling surgeries. His recovery was long and painful, but eventually he was able to hike up Sahali Peak with me over a weekend. It was a long weekend, and it was slow going, and at one point, Mark thought he wasn't going to be able to continue. I offered to carry his pack and mine and shuttled them back and forth, but we got up to the camp spot before sunset, and it was an incredible sunset that evening. We were camping above the trees, and Johannesburg was sticking out above it, and Mark had a huge smile on his face from the accomplishment of being able to once again climb. Mark was a bit quirky, and of course my wife is probably smiling, thinking the pot is calling the kettle black. We're all a bit quirky, every one of us, I'm sure. But he had a dream, and that was to move into the mountains of Alaska and live in a cabin. And he did that. There were many moving parts to that project, and many of us would have done it differently, but Mark did it. He pulled it off. He had his dream cabin built with a shop that was the size of a small fire station. And he had all of his worldly possessions barged up to Talkeetna. He was getting ready to start sorting through it and getting his shop set up, and he had great plans, and he'd drawn pictures of that. Unfortunately, his plan was set back a bit when he had to return to Seattle for surgery and nearly a year of recovery. The Kent firefighters assisted Mark with an apartment for the year. He was able to get back on his feet and return to his cabin. Being a man, and an Alaskan, and being Mark, he just toughed it out when he began to experience discomfort and loss of strength and other issues. He ended up one night on the ground hanging onto the bumper of his truck in sub-zero weather. At that point he realized, I think I've got to go home. And that started the project of trying to get back to Seattle, get surgery, and get fixed. Unfortunately, he would not be able to return to his cabin. His post-surgery recovery and rehab began just as COVID started to become known. Mark had to move into skilled nursing, and those were some miserable months for him. No visitors. I was able to visit initially as a friend, and then I must confess I might have gone up a couple of times in my Class Bs with a clipboard and a radio, and they assumed I was the fire marshal, and I didn't dispel that rumor. So I was able to get several more visits out of the deal. Peter was able to set up something so that Mark could make phone calls, get on the internet, do all sorts of things without using his hands. I don't know how he did it. He was able to call people. He was able to send them photographs. It was pretty cool. He was pretty positive and upbeat pretty much up until the last few months. Oftentimes, people that would visit him or talk to him would comment how they were upset, and Mark was trying to make them feel better and being upbeat about the situation. Ultimately, those last few months became quite painful for him. I don't know where Mark has gone to, but I expect that in the end, we'll all end up there. Mark's going to be easy to find. He'll be the bare-chested guy that's up there because he's already given his shirt off his back to them. Mark loved his family. Mark loved the fire department. Mark loved climbing. Mark loved the Lung Association, and any and all of you that are here today. And I'm really proud to be able to say that Mark was a friend of mine. A lot of people have said to me, gosh, thank you so much for helping take care of Mark. But the truth of the matter is, hey, anyone would do that. I just thought about myself being in his position, and I'd be terrified. And so, hey, I did all the things for him that I hate to do for me, and I just hope that somebody would do that for me as well. It was a learning experience for both of us. It changed our relationship a bit, but Mark reached out to a lot of people just in the time that he was in that bed. And having all of you communicate with him made a huge difference. Thank you much. I'm going to have Johnny and Glenn come up.
My name is John Giddings. I met Mark down in the Joshua Tree Desert, 1992. I think it would have been fall of 1992. He and I both were taking the same rope rescue class, and being Northwesterners, we hit it off quickly, at least as far as that was concerned. I realized that he was volunteering for the Lung Association doing climbing. I was volunteering for the Lung Association with their bicycling, and so we had lots of good stories because we crossed paths with a lot of the same full-time lung folk. So that was very good. And it was just great. One of the things that was very good, at least to sort of cement a relationship, was we were 7 days of spending 16 hours a day doing rope rescue in a small group. I think there were 10 of us in the class. And so we had lots of together time, lots of time tying each other up in baskets, so it was an opportunity for me to get to know Mark pretty quickly. And then he and I both were invited back to be instructors. So that just started what turned out to be a long relationship down at Peak Rescue. And I won't go into great detail with that. Glenn and I are going to bang some stories back and forth. But one of my favorite memories was I was a fireman for 40 years or so in South Snohomish County, Mark obviously being down here. And he was on engine 22 at the time, and I was on engine 22. And we were both up at the academy doing some multi-company operation training in our respective engines. So I think he got to keep engine 22. Our crew had to go to some fictitious engine number. But we decided on our way back, because he was living in North Bend, and we were talking before we left about, hey, what if we just stop and get something to eat? So I remember stopping at the golf course in North Bend with both our engines, both engine 22, and hanging out with Mark and his crew, our crew, for probably 2 hours when our chiefs would have rather had us back in our area. But we were, at that point, nobody was saying anything, so we had a wonderful time doing that. So lots of great memories for me with Mark.
I also met Mark through Peak Rescue when he came down and took the class and started working through the whole instructor phase. And instantly you could tell that Mark, he had that quality to him that he was the good guy. Like if you had to look up in the dictionary, the good guy, Mark was that guy. Like Andy said, he'd give you the shirt off his back, and that's literally would give you the shirt off of his back. Mark, as most of you, anybody who knows him, Mark was taken to telling a story or two once in a while. So many of you have heard the same stories more than once, perhaps, and you realize, like, oh, I thought many times, hey, Mark, I don't have time right now. I've got to get this done. I'm working on something. And Mark could be standing over next to you telling the story, and you're trying to get something done. Hey, right now, I'd give money to have Mark here telling one of those recycled stories. And I would love that. So, but I don't think there would have ever been an opportunity or a time when Mark would say, I don't have time for you. So that was a beautiful thing. In the last year or so, Edith spent a lot of time on the phone. That's my wife. Spent a lot of time on the phone with Mark, telling those same stories back and forth again. But Mark was a friend. If anything, Mark was a friend. And the thing is, even when he went to Talkeetna, there were people there. We went and met some of the local people, and some of them, they'd say, oh, yeah, I think I know who you're talking about. He moved to town. I think I know. Mark knew all of them, and he knew their backstories. So even with people that weren't quite as close as he might have thought of them, he made himself close to people and took the time to get to know them, to know their stories, and to share those. So if you have Mark as a friend, he was locked in for the deal. So that's kind of what I think about with Mark. And yeah, he was a true blue kind of guy. And for whatever level of annoyance that you ever got from him, you were paid back in spades with loyalty, because he was a loyal dude.
Yeah, he was. I was just thinking too that towards the end, so after Mark had surgeries, he became pretty unstable, and when we were down teaching, he would no longer get up onto the rocks and do instruction up there, but he always, I think always, did our equipment lecture, which was the very first lecture of the class. And because we liked gear, we had lots of equipment. And as much as we as a group liked gear, Mark liked it better. He was like, he totally loved gear. And there were times where it's like, Mark, we've got to hold the equipment lecture down to, I don't know, like 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours tonight, because he would just go on and on, which was fun. I mean, it was always a good time. But as he was no longer getting up on the rocks and I was getting older, and we had a bunch of new instructors that actually really wanted to teach, and I was to the point where I told Glenn one year, it's like, you know what, I want to be like the instructor emeritus. I want to be the guy that used to teach, still could if I had to, but I'm just going to sit in the chair and watch things. I'll be kind of like the camp old guy. And so Mark and I got the chance, probably for the last couple of years I was there, to spend a lot of time just sitting and chatting about this, that, and the other thing, because we didn't have much to do. Every once in a while it's like, hey, a battery needs charged. All right, well, one of us would get up and go do that. But most of the time we would just sit, and he would tell me stories, I would tell him stories, and that was great. And Andy mentioned about Mark being an artist. So if, as I'm walking around, and you want to walk around behind me and look at the back of my shirt, you can actually see some of Mark's art, because he would do the drawings for most of our shirts. So the back of my shirt is one of Mark's drawings.
And of course, Mark loved being a fireman, and he loved the Kirkland Fire Department. And Mark could tell these stories. You know, all the guys that have ever worked for any fire department have their war stories that they like to tell, and I heard some of them multiple times, but I've learned to love it, and it's like, oh, I kind of feel like I was around the place, you know. He talked about, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a guy studying for one of the tests, but he had the book of knowledge, you know, that nobody else was allowed to look at the book of knowledge. He told the story of the multiple units being called for a woman thrown from a vehicle on the 405 freeway. Units coming from one direction, from another direction, and when Mark finally gets there, there's a woman standing along on the shoulder, and she says, yes, my boyfriend stopped me, threw me out of the car, he told me get out. Okay, cancel all units. You know, I feel like I was on that call so many times, but I loved it. And it's like, and then when you finally realize, hey, I in the last year called Mark many times, and on a couple of occasions I'd say, hey, tell me about the story about the woman thrown from a vehicle, you know, and it was wonderful. So he loved you guys. He loved the fire department. He loved being a firefighter. It was a central part of his character and his life story. But more even than that, his daughters figured into a lot of stories, and he would weave together all the different people in his life. Everybody came in at different points, and he would talk about his daughters. And one of the things he'd love to tell is, I would do these imitations of Princess Bride lines, and then he would tell how Jesse and Jenny watched The Princess Bride finally, and then told him, "Oh no, Dad, Glenn does it better," you know. So it's an amazing thing that in Mark's life, it wasn't just individual incidents. Everything was woven together in one big messy ball. So.
Hello, my name is Mike Gruber, and I had the good fortune to get to know Mark Anderson through the Climb for Clean Air. And I think today we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on that part of his life. So 18 years ago, in 2004, I signed up for the Climb for Clean Air, dug through the closet today and found the shirt from that year. And I want to tell you the kind of impact that Mark had, and I think this dovetails with the story you just heard. Long before there was a term influencer, Mark was one. And he was for me. So in that climb, I'd never tackled a mountain of that size. We had an early training hike on Little Side. And I purposely dropped to the back to talk with Mark Anderson because this guy seemed like he knew what was going on, and he was sweeping that day. And I asked him a question. I said, "What's the secret to getting to the top?" And he said, "The training's important." He said, "The real secret is the people that really want it are the ones that get it." Okay, we roll forward a few months to July of 2004. We're on the climb. We take off after our night stay, and we get up to what's appropriately named Disappointment Cleaver. And nobody had prepared me for the fact that, yep, we're wearing crampons, and we're actually using crampons over rocks. And to add to the challenge, our guide was not granted the gift of patience. And there was a group ahead of us that was going slower than he liked. So he decided to leave the route, and now we're scrambling over more challenging rocks, and we're short roped. And I come to the realization if I take a tumble, I'm going to get hurt, and I'm going to pull some people with me, and they're going to get hurt. So we get through that, we take a break, and the guides say, we're not parking anyone higher on the mountain, so you need to make a decision. This is to the whole group. If you're leaving here, you're going for the summit. And I remember thinking at the time, good God, if it gets any tougher than this, I'm not sure if I can do it. And then the message from Mark Anderson went through my head. And I remember thinking, I've never trained so hard for something as this. I really want it. And I summited the mountain. And honestly, I'm not sure that would have been the outcome if I'd not gotten that sage advice from Mark Anderson. And it became monumental for me, not in terms of a career with the fire department. It became monumental because I came back 2 years later and climbed again, and he asked me to be a guide. And I guided with the Climb for Clean Air all the way until a couple of years ago. And I met Bonnie Seafelt and this great cast of characters. That, he had really surrounded himself with a wonderful group of people. And I heard their stories about climbing peaks around the world, and I had the good fortune to do that. And here again, it was that early seed and the guidance and influence from Mark. And what a wonderful human being, generous beyond belief. I think back to all those years. I can't think of a time when he was running the climb when he wasn't there for one of the trainings. So we'll miss him. Already do. And just wanted to take a minute to honor him today.
So my name is Chris Tubbs. I first met Mark in 1973. We lived about a block apart from each other. My family had moved back from Australia onto Mercer Island, and I met Mark in the Boy Scouts, and we grew up together, sharing a lot of those adventures. And in junior high and high school, I got into photography very, very deeply. And when I was in high school, I worked for the newspaper, high school newspaper, and my instructor asked me to write a story. So I thought about, well, what would I want to write about? And I decided to write a story about Mark because he was a volunteer firefighter for the Mercer Island Fire Department. I had an uncle who had worked for Los Angeles City Fire Department, so that connection for me was where the interest came in. So I met with Mark several times, put the story together. One weekend I was down at Station 92. Mark was working. One of the crew members working with him was a woman named Elizabeth Eady, who went on to work for Seattle PD. And Mark and Elizabeth put a little pressure on me, and they said, we're always looking for firefighters. You ought to think about joining. So I put an application in, not knowing where it would lead. I didn't know what I wanted to do for a career at that point. And very quickly I discovered the fire service was my passion. I actually got on board the same time as Dave Owings, personnel number 522-523. But I quickly discovered that the fire service was what I was meant to do. And I ended up working for the Mercer Island Fire Department from 1982 till 2014 when I retired. I now work in California for a fire department down there, Southern Marin Fire Protection District. But the reason I'm in the fire service is because of Mark Anderson. He helped me find what it was that I was supposed to do. And I'll be forever grateful for that. Matter of fact, I had the opportunity to talk to Mark shortly before he passed away, and we shared that conversation. I thanked him for that. So, thanks, Tim.